Hello everybody, my name is Stephen Payne. I'm a naval architect and I'm with the Royal Institution of Naval Architects. Our lecture today, Advanced Titanic, diving deeper into the disastrous story. And this is a follow-up lecture to my previous one about the Titanic, but this time looking at more detail into some aspects of the disaster and what actually happened. Now, before we can do that, we need to really recap as to why the Titanic was built. And that was because of the intense competition at the end of the 19th century. All the steamship lines like White Star Line, North German Lloyd and Cunard, all vying for the traffic to cross the Atlantic. And really the expense and cost of building new ships and also operating them. And things came to a head when the Germans started introducing four-funnelled ships that were the fastest liners in the world. They took a large amount of the traffic. And then Pierpont Morgan decided to buy up many of the steamship lines, including White Star Line, into a big American combine called the International Mercantile Marine. And Cunard at this point really needed some new ships to compete, and they were able, with the help of the British government, to build two ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, in 1907. Tremendous ships that captured the cream of the transatlantic trade. But that left White Star in a quandary because they needed to also follow up and compete with Cunard, but without any government subsidy. And they chose to build three very much larger ships, the Olympic class, ships that would be half as big again as the Mauretania and Lusitania, but that would be more economic to operate. So slower speed, but many, many more passengers. And of the three of them, the Olympic was the first. She completed in 1911. Titanic was the second of the three ships. She completed in 1912. And the third ship was originally going to be called Gigantic, but she was completed as the Britannic in 1915 during the First World War. And these ships, as I've said, were designed to return a profit without the subsidies of the government. And so they had large number of passengers. They were well appointed, but they weren't extravagant with space. But to make them look the part and to make them compete against the Mauretania and Lusitania, they also had four funnels, but only three of them were actually real. One of them was a dummy. And as I said previously in the first lecture, these ships complied with all the rules and regulations at the time that they were designed and built. The Olympic, first ship of the trio, she set new standards of luxury and comfort for both first, second and third class passengers. She was the largest ship in the world when she was built, but she wasn't the fastest. And there was a tremendous amount of publicity at her introduction, and she was immensely successful. And then a year later, the Titanic entered service. And there were some improvements to her design, and that was done through operating the Olympic, and they could see that various things could be improved. They partially enclosed the first class promenade so that it wouldn't be so windy. And on B deck, the original promenade was eliminated, and that was used to enlarge the cabins on that deck. A new facility was added, the Café Parisien, that was sure to be a big success. But the big thing with Titanic was that her introduction into service was a very low-key, no fanfare entry into service, because after all, she was just the second of the 3 ships. Now let's look at this improvement. This is the Olympic and that B-deck promenade. So first class passengers would be able to walk from one end of the superstructure to the other. But on the Titanic, this area that you see arrowed and the promenade there, it was changed to incorporate a private promenade for a grand suite, featured heavily in James Cameron's movie Titanic, and the Café Parisien, as we've mentioned. So this is where that promenade was on the Olympic. And if we look at the deck plans, the top there, we can see the plan of that grand suite with the private promenade and the dining room and the 2 bedrooms. And the lower plan shows that the cabins extend right out to the ship's side. And that simple expediency of using that open space on the Olympic actually made the Titanic slightly larger than a younger, or older rather, sister. So here's the Titanic in the ocean dock at Southampton that was built for the 3 sister ships, and she's about to set off on her maiden voyage. It was 10th of April 1912 at noon. There had been a national coal strike in Southampton and the rest of the country, and it was very difficult for the ship to get coal, and the only reason she was able to sail was by taking coal from other ships of the White Star Line and the American Mercantile Marine. So they sacrificed their coal to enable the Titanic to set sail. And as she was being pulled from the White Star dock to be turned towards the open sea, she dragged other ships from their moorings, and there was almost a collision. And it's crucial to realize that if that collision had taken place, Titanic probably wouldn't have sailed that day, because she would have needed thorough inspections. And of course, events that would be in train later in a few days' time probably wouldn't have happened. So it's unlikely she would have encountered the iceberg had she had that collision in Southampton. And here we see the picture of tugboats pulling the other ships away from the Titanic as Titanic set off down Southampton water to the English Channel and then onwards to the open sea. So Titanic left Southampton, sailed across the English Channel to Cherbourg, where she arrived in the evening. And then overnight, she sailed to Queenstown, which is Cove, where she arrived at noon on the 11th of April. And then she set off on a fateful transatlantic crossing. During the transit across the Atlantic, there was no big problems. There was a small smouldering fire in one of the coal bunkers, but that was quite normal and was controlled by hosing the coal down with water, keeping the fire under control. But the sea temperature dramatically fell. It got colder and colder, but nonetheless, Titanic's speed was slowly increasing to her maximum speed of 22 knots. And here we see Gordon Bowen's magnificent painting of the Titanic as she leaves Ireland and sets off across the North Atlantic. Now we're going to talk about the engines and the way the Titanic was propelled, because I think this has a big impact on what happened on that fateful night. And the Titanic was driven by 3 engines. 2 of these, which are reciprocating steam engines, steam from the boilers is channeled into those great big pistons that you see there, and it pushes down the connecting rod and turns the propeller shaft. So she had 2 of these really huge engines, and they weighed over 600 tons each. Even the bed plates weighed over 200 tons, And then the supporting brackets that you see here, each one of those weighed 50 tons. And the cylinders themselves, that structure you see at the top, which is the cylinder, each of those was over 50 tons. So two of these immense engines, and they extracted as much as the power as possible from the steam, and then they exhausted into a steam turbine. And that this was for economy, because the two large reciprocating engines, they produced 15,000 shaft horsepower each, and their waste steam that would otherwise have been wasted driving this turbine, that generated another 16,000 shaft horsepower. So 46,000 shaft horsepower would drive the Titanic around 22 knots with a coal consumption of about 750 tons per day. So we're now April the 14th, and this really is the anatomy of the disaster. There were two lookouts up in the crow's nest. It's a really clear, dark night, no moonlight. And then suddenly at 11:40, so 20 minutes to midnight, the two lookouts discerned ahead of the ship a huge iceberg. And they could only really see that from the lack of stars around the shape of the iceberg, and also the fact that there was a little bit of sloshing at the base of the iceberg that created some white wavelets. So immediately a whole train of things went into play, and the order was given to turn the ship. And we're going to talk about the design of the rudder on the Titanic. The rudder was like a sailing ship rudder, being a single flat plate. Modern day rudders are shaped like an aeroplane wing. And the idea is that when you move them off their centerline position, the aeroplane wing distorts the flow of water around the wing or the rudder, and that creates an extra kick, an extra force that swings a ship around. But Titanic didn't have that. Her rudder was set immediately behind that center propeller that was driven by the steam turbine. And we see here a picture at the aft end actually of the Olympic, and to the left you can see one of the propellers from the reciprocating engine. The center propeller there immediately in front of the rudder is the turbine propeller, and then through the opening there you may be able to see that the third propeller that was driven by the reciprocating engine. So you can see here that a lot of the effectiveness of the rudder actually comes from the running of that center propeller. And we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail. We see here a plan of the ship with the two large triple expansion engines, and we see the centerline turbine there, and we see to the left diagram showing the three propellers. And then I've done a simplified drawing here for you. It shows the two big reciprocating engines and the center turbine with their propellers, and immediately behind that center propeller, the straight line that represents the rudder. And then when you turn the ship, the rudder is turned, and that deflects a lot of the water flow from that center propeller, and that really helps turn the ship. On ships that didn't have the center propeller, you were just relying on the flow of water around the ship rather than the extra kick that propeller gave you. So for the Olympic class and Titanic, that center propeller was very, very important in actually turning the ship. And it's also interesting to know about the rudder orders and the way they were given. In 1912, the rudder orders were given in the reverse sense. So the officers on the Titanic wanted to push the ship round to the left to steer around the iceberg, but they ordered hard a starboard because of this reverse sense. And in fact, after the disaster, it was decided to universally change the orders so that if you said hard a starboard, you meant the ship to go to starboard. But there was a lot of criticism of James Cameron's film that they said the order wrong in the film. In fact, it was correct. It was just that was the convention at the time. So we've spoken about the rudder, we've spoken about the engines, and now we come to the collision itself. And this is the crucial thing about this part of the lecture and what we've really been building up to. As soon as the iceberg was spotted and the order was given to change course, 37 seconds elapsed and the ship sped on for another 430 meters. And it was towards the end of that 37 seconds, the bow started to move round to port to miss the iceberg. And we're going to look at that in this diagram. So you see there to the left is a little icon showing Titanic. To the right is the triangle, which is the iceberg. And the Titanic moves on, continuing to go almost directly ahead towards the iceberg. And then after 430 meters or 37 seconds, the ship begins to swing round. And she bumps along the side of the iceberg. So it was so marginal. It wasn't a head-on collision. It was a glancing blow, if you like. But what we've got to remember, what happened here is that when the order was given to change course and to stop those big reciprocating engines, those great big engines took time to actually stop. But their exhaust steam into that steam turbine could be shut off relatively quickly. And so the steam turbine almost immediately was devoid of any power. And what I think is that if that center propeller had kept running, maybe the extra force from that propeller being deflected with the rudder, you never know, it may have been just enough to have made sure that the Titanic cleared the iceberg. It's all supposition, but what I'm really trying to bring home here is that this was such a marginal event. It almost didn't happen, but unfortunately, of course, it did. And after the Titanic sank in the various inquiries, there was a lot of analysis done between the rudder designs of the Titanic and the Mauretania, the Cunard ship that preceded her. And we see here the Mauretania as a fully submerged, what we call a semi-balanced rudder. So it's a rudder that's a lot easier to turn, can be turned much more quickly. Whereas the Titanic, with her old-fashioned sailing ship type rudder, it needed a lot more force to actually turn the rudder. And that could have been a factor in that it was slower in actually turning the rudder. And so the turn was that much slower. As we said, she bumped along the side of the iceberg on her starboard side. Along this area was where the ice scraped along the side. What we think is the infamous iceberg, because it was spotted near the scene of the collision a few days later with red paint scraped along the bottom edge. So we think obviously a ship had struck that iceberg, and that was likely the one. Now we see here a fairly technical plan showing all the bulkheads of the Titanic. And at the right-hand side, we see the extent of the damage. All those forward compartments were damaged. Almost 1/3 of the length of the ship, nearly 300 feet in total. And we look here at respective plans of the lower decks of the Titanic and the Mauretania, because again, at the various inquiries, they were wondering whether or not Mauretania would have been able to have survived the collision with the iceberg. Was her subdivision better? And in fact, when you look at the two plans, you can see that at the side of the ship, the very bottom of the diagram here, at the side of the ship, you can see that that's where the coal bunkers are. And the argument was, well, perhaps those coal bunkers would cushion the collision. And if they did get damaged, they would fill up with water. And the main part of the ship in the middle there wouldn't fill up with water. Well, in fact, of course, because they were coal bunkers, you needed to get the coal from those places into the boilers. And so you needed hatches, watertight doors. And with coal dust, they were never, ever watertight. And in fact, when you look at all this plan, you see that Titanic subdivision was actually rather good. And certainly a few years later, when the Lusitania was torpedoed during the First World War, in her forward area, she sank in only 18 minutes. So her subdivision didn't keep her afloat very long, whereas Titanic lasted nearly 3 hours. And what we've seen in the previous lecture, that the noted engineering book, The Shipbuilder, said that the captain, by simply moving a switch on the bridge, could close all the watertight doors. Here are the doors. But you see here to the left is one of those doors to the coal bunker. And you can just imagine that with all that coal and grit in that sliding mechanism, it certainly wouldn't have been watertight, and water would have flowed through on the Lusitania and Mauretania. Now, Titanic could float with any 2 of her 16 watertight compartments flooded. She could even float with the first 5 compartments flooded. But again, this tragedy, she went just that little bit further, and the damage extended a few feet into the 6th compartment. And with 6 compartments, it was a certainty that she would sink. Now, there's been a lot of analysis, modern analysis of the sinking and the Royal Institution of Naval Architects. In 1996, 2 of the naval architects from Harland and Wolff, where the ship was built, they used modern techniques to analyze the sinking. And there was a lot of discussion about the height of the watertight bulkheads, and we see them here arrowed in red. And the fact that the top of these individual bulkheads, so where the thick line stops, wasn't watertight to the deck. There was a small gap, and that was there for ventilation. A lot of people think with that gap, if you filled up these compartments, it was inevitable that the water would flow over the top. So why have these bulkheads? Well, these bulkheads are actually much higher than they are on some modern ships. And the fact is that when you flood so many forward compartments, the bow dips down so much that the water line, where the ship is actually sinking down to at any moment in time, is well above where those watertight bulkheads finish. And in any case, you imagine that a deck is not going to be completely watertight, because you've got staircases, you've got pipe trunks and things like that. And even a modern day cruise ship, there was one cruise ship that sadly ran onto a rock, and people thought it wasn't too badly damaged, but it sank. And that's because the water actually found its way through the toilet system and flooded the rest of the ship. So these things sometimes look obvious, but when you delve into the intricacies, it's much, much more complex. And certainly many of these things are looked at very, very carefully when we design ships today. And here we see the output from the investigation, from that analysis of the Titanic using the modern techniques. And we can see that as the forward compartments flooded, when you go from condition C1 down to C4, as each compartment is flooded, the bow sinks further and further down. And that's, of course, when you get flooding over the top and beyond those watertight bulkheads. And that's shown eloquently here. And of course, the outcome is absolutely inevitable. And even today, for most ships to be damaged for 1/3 of their length, it would be very difficult for even modern ships to survive so much damage. But nonetheless, one really amazing thing from this analysis, and looking at the length of time it took Titanic to sink, although the damage was spread over 300 feet, the cumulative damage, if you did the holes and brought them all together, would only be just over 12.5 square feet. So that relatively small 12.5 square feet spread over that 300 feet length, that's what doomed the Titanic. Now, one of the things we didn't talk about in the first lecture was the Californian. She was another ship in the Titanic's vicinity. And when the Titanic struck the iceberg and came to a stop and was gradually sinking, the Titanic could see another ship in the distance, and that was actually the Californian. But the Californian's radio operator had gone to bed, so he didn't pick up any of the distress messages. The Californian actually saw the Titanic and saw that she was firing off rockets, but they thought it was a fireworks show. They had no idea, or it didn't conclude to them, that perhaps the ship was sinking. And Californian actually saw the shape of the Titanic change as she was sinking under the water. And they assumed that the change in shape was because this other ship, which they didn't know which one it was actually moving away. Incredible situation. And in 1992, the British Marine Accident Investigation Bureau reappraised what happened that night to see if there was any real blame or consequences on the Californian not going to the Titanic's help. And the conclusion they raised was that it was unlikely the Californian would have reached the Titanic in time, because just a few hours, and with the speed the Californian could go, she wouldn't reach the Titanic in time. And that the people that left the Titanic and were in the freezing water, because their life expectancy was just a few minutes, they would have been long dead before the Californian actually arrived at the site where the Titanic sank. Nonetheless, very, very interesting circumstances. So we see here the top deck of Titanic, the boat deck, and the boats ranged along the starboard side here. And of course, we've spoken about lifeboats in the previous lecture. The Titanic had life-saving for over 2,380. The rules and regulations only stipulated that 756 lifeboat places were actually required. So Titanic had more life-saving capacity than the rules and regulations stipulated. And it was absolutely considered that the lifeboats were there not to save lives, but merely to transfer passengers from a sinking ship to another ship that they assumed would be able to be called close in time. Nobody ever considered that a ship like the Titanic would sink in under 3 hours. And of course, the dreadful experience that the passengers in the boats had, being slipped down this huge mountain of the side of a ship down into the water. And the brutal statistics here was that Titanic had 2,224 persons on board. In fact, crucially, she was only half full when she set sail. She could have had twice as many passengers on board. Of that number, 710 persons were saved, and just over 1,500 sadly perished. Now, one of the crucial things about the way the Titanic sank was that, did she break in half during her sinking? There was some eyewitnesses said that she did, but it's always been a lot of speculation, and it was only put to rest when the wreck was discovered by Robert Ballard of the Woods Hole Institute, and he found most definitely that the Titanic was in 2 parts. The forward part was in relatively good condition. The aft part was completely broken and mangled up. And we're going to look into why the Titanic should actually split in 2. And I've tried here to do a little diagram to show you what happens when a ship passes through waves. So the 2 red lines are rather crude representations of a ship, and the wavy line is the sea. So on the top view, we have troughs at both ends of the ship with the crest in the middle. And on the bottom diagram, we have the trough in the middle of the ship and the crests at both ends. And as the wave passes along the ship bends like a banana. In the top diagram, as the crest passes the middle of the ship, because of the extra buoyancy, the ship is bent in that direction, and down below, when the crests are at each end of the ship bends in the opposite sense. So ship is flexing the whole time, bending, also twisting, but it's the bending here that we're looking at. And this puts an enormous amount of stress on the superstructure of a ship. And when the Olympic class were designed, they didn't have the computing skills or the knowledge, no computers, of course, to actually design the structure to take into account all of these stresses. And you can see here in this diagram, nice regular triangle there, all the forces generally distributed. And then when it's canted into the banana shape, that top part, you imagine the amount of stress built up at the top there. And that, of course, can lead to cracks. And if you leave cracks too long, they propagate, and in the end, you have a disaster. And so in order to relieve that stress and stop the cracking, you have what we call an expansion joint, a cut through the structure. And that's what you see here on Olympic. And in fact, Titanic had the same thing. And the idea is that as the ship bends and twists, this is able to take that into account. And so we see here Titanic sinking as the stern lifts out of the water. All that weight of the stern is unsupported. And that's where those great big reciprocating engines, 600 tons each at the back. And so they're trying to pull and break the ship in half. And we see here the actual wreck of the Titanic and the place where one of those expansion joints was. So did the ship break in half because of the expansion joint and the way it is there? Well, for a long time, we thought that that was the way it happened. But in fact, in 2009, a technical paper which is a collaboration with American and British naval architects and marine engineers. They thoroughly investigated this, and they found that the mechanism of the breakup of the ship was that the bottom of the ship, the part in red that you see here, the red dot is where the maximum stress is, but below that, you can see that the red part of the actual keel of the ship, that's what they think actually failed, and then the expansion joint after that. So there's always something new to learn with the Titanic and the way it sank. And there have been all sorts of other papers as well. That this is another one looking into the human factor. Was the captain and his officers under stress when they set off on the maiden voyage, because it was at that stage the world's largest ship? Did they make the wrong decisions, and why? Tremendous amount of information out there, and analysis and different prognosis. But of course, as we have seen, Titanic did sink. And I'd just like to reiterate once again from the first lecture that in those days, the wages of all the crew on board actually stopped the moment the ship sank. And even the poor stewards that were actually buying their uniforms on with loans and that, as soon as the ship sank, White Star Line was calling their widows and that for the money for those uniforms, which hopefully is a situation we wouldn't have today. Here we see the few passengers that got off the ship in the boats being rescued by the heroine of the night, the Cunard liner Carpathia, picking up the boats and taking them to New York. So in the final few minutes of the lecture, we're going to look at what happened to the other sister ships of Titanic. Well, Olympic was sent for a huge refit in December of 1912, £250,000, which was a huge amount of money in those days. And you see all the additional lifeboats that were added on top of the ship. And inside the ship, as far as they possibly could, they built extra bulkheads to give her more subdivision and more protection. And she had a very successful career, had a few incidents, a collision with the Royal Navy cruiser in 1911. During the First World War, she actually rammed and sank a U-boat. But in 1934, she rammed and sank the Nantucket light vessel because she was using that as a honing position to reach New York. And sadly, in fog, she actually rammed it and sank the light vessel. She was withdrawn in March of 1935 and sold for scrap several months later at Jarrow as a means of relieving the unemployment in the Depression at the time. But she was known as Old Reliable. And here we see her being broken up at Jarrow. The third ship, originally to be named Gigantic, the name was changed to Britannic, and she was completed in 1915. And you see behind the fourth funnel these enormous davits. And she also had extra subdivisions. She was actually built slightly wider, so she could have more of these bulkheads fitted inside the ship in an attempt to make her even more safe from flooding. And we see here the plan of the ship, and you can just see at the bottom level there the double line along the side of the ship. Well, that's the double skin that was built in an attempt to make her more subdivided. But she struck a mine in 1916 while she was on hospital ship service. Thankfully, she hadn't yet picked up all the wounded from the Gallipoli campaign, so there were relatively few people on board. 30 people died, but she sank in only 55 minutes. And it's largely thought that the explosion from the mine disturbed the coal dust in her bunkers, and that it exploded and destroyed a lot of the subdivision and that's why she sank so quickly. They experimented with these very ungainly davits with nested lifeboats. You see them here, and it's not really clear here, but you can see the forward and aft where the funnels are there. You can see these nested boats. But my word, when you think of a ship sinking and heeling over to one side, and you've got to load each one of these boats, lower it down, bring back the crane, hook it up to the next boat, put the boat in position, load the boat, lower it. It's an enormous kerfuffle. And if you've only got 55 minutes or even 3 hours to launch 5 boats, as implied here, I think would have been a very tall order. And I certainly don't understand how that could have been allowed. And so we've looked into more detail into various aspects of the Titanic, but the overriding thing is that her loss spurned the maritime community into bringing in new safety regulations. And originally, there was going to be an international safety conference with maritime safety rules across the nations of the world brought in 1914. Sadly, the outbreak of the First World War stopped that, and it wasn't until 1929 that every nation could come together and a new set of rules was laid down. This was thoroughly updated in 1948, adding various things like fire safety and the like, because it was determined that building ships with a lot of wood paneling and the like was not the best things to do, and to have sprinkler systems and pumping systems. All these things were introduced by these different regulations. And then the regulations were updated again in 1960 and again in 1974. And since then, rather than updating the whole lot of the regulations, because there's now so many of them, it's deemed more efficient to update just separate sections of them, piecemeal, bit by bit. And so we have a lot of extra things like safe return to port, where you've got to be able to demonstrate that if you severely damage your ship, that she can still safely return to port by using the facilities like engines in the other compartments. And this extends to the point that you've got to have cooking facilities in several areas around the ship. So if you damage one part of the ship, you're still able to feed the passengers and crew. And certainly from various incidents that there have been fires on ship where it's knocked out the whole of the toilet system. And when you've got a ship with, say, 3,500 people unable to dump sewage overboard or use the toilets, it rapidly becomes a very, very nasty situation on board. And so these safe return to port rules actually cover that as well. So tremendous influence. And all of this came about from the Titanic. And of course, she also introduced the necessity for the International Ice Patrol to track icebergs. The use of radar, of course, is a more modern innovation that can hopefully track icebergs and the like. And in the radio telegraphy, it was determined that an automatic system, that even if the operator had gone to bed like he'd done on the California or Californian, that if an SOS is sent out, it would ring a buzzer and alert them that there was something amiss and that they needed to take the message. So Titanic, the Olympic class were conceived in 1908 as a challenge to Cunard and their Mauretania Lusitania. The last of the 3 ships, the Olympic, left the scene in 1935. But even today, 1921, the effect of Titanic is still very much with us. And as a naval architect of passenger ships, it's still very much in my mind when I design and think about building a new passenger ship, or indeed any other ship. So that concludes the lecture for today. I hope you've enjoyed looking into various details. Thank you all very much indeed.